The temperature read 8 degrees below zero on January 15th, 1863. Barbara Jones stood at the mouth of a limestone cave, her 3-week-old son nursing against her chest, watching the sun rise over a valley filled with frozen cattle. 7 of Ezekiel Hammer's herd lay scattered across his pasture, dead where they stood, ice coating their stiff bodies. They had frozen upright in their shelter. Inside Barbara's cave, 14 cattle stood calmly chewing hay at 54 degrees. She had survived the worst blizzard in Virginia Highland memory, pregnant, alone with 2 children, dismissed by every neighbor who called her plan suicide. This is how a desperate widow turned the mountain itself into a bunker that saved everything she had. Barbara Jones stood at the mouth of a limestone cave, her breath crystallizing into white vapor that caught the first gray light of dawn. January 15th, 1863. The worst cold snap the Virginia Highlands had seen in living memory. She looked down into the valley where Ezekiel Hammer's farm sprawled across the frozen landscape. His cattle lay scattered across the pasture like dark stones, 7 head, frozen where they stood in their inadequate shelter. Ice coated their bodies. They had died standing up. Barbara turned back toward the cave's interior. Warm air drifted past her face, 54 degrees, steady as a heartbeat. Inside, a single tallow candle cast flickering shadows across the limestone walls. Her children slept on a raised wooden platform covered in straw and quilts. Her 3-week-old son, William, nursed contentedly against her chest, wrapped in wool, utterly unaware that the world outside was trying to kill him. Deeper in the cave, separated by a stone wall she had built with her own blistered hands, 14 cattle shifted and lowed softly. 6 hogs grunted in their pen. Chickens roosted on wooden perches, occasionally clucking, all of them alive. Barbara stepped back into the cave's warmth and let the hide flap fall closed behind her. The wind screamed across the ridge, carrying temperatures that would freeze a man's lungs in minutes. Somewhere in the valley, smoke rose from a cabin chimney where a family huddled around their last scraps of firewood, praying for dawn. But 4 months earlier, Barbara Jones had stood at this same cave mouth with nothing but a candle and a desperate idea, and neighbors who told her she was leading her children to certain death. September of 1862 arrived with the first hints of frost on the morning grass, and a truth Barbara could no longer deny. She was running out of time. Her husband Samuel had enlisted with the Pocahontas Riflemen in April of '61, full of fire about defending Virginia from northern aggression. He had been wounded at the Battle of Cheat Mountain that September, a musket ball through his thigh that the surgeons said would heal fine. It didn't. Infection set in, turning the wound black and spreading poison through his blood. Samuel Jones died in October of '61, leaving Barbara with an 87-acre farm, 2 children, and a pregnancy she discovered 3 weeks after they buried him. Now, a full year later, Barbara stood in her farmyard taking stock of what remained. Firewood, 3 cords stacked against the cabin's north wall. Her husband had always cut 8 to 10 cords by September. She had managed 3 while keeping the farm running, the children fed, and her body from collapsing under the weight of pregnancy. 3 cords might last 60 days if she burned sparingly. Winter in these mountains lasted 120. Livestock. 14 cattle remained of the original 18. Confederate quartermasters had requisitioned 4 head in July, leaving promissory notes worth less than the paper they were printed on. 6 hogs rooted in their pen. A dozen chickens scratched in the dirt. 2 draft horses stood in the small barn, their ribs showing more than Barbara liked. The cabin itself listed slightly to the east where the foundation stones had shifted. Gaps showed between the logs where the chinking had crumbled. She could see daylight through the walls in 3 places. Samuel had planned to repair it all before winter. Samuel was bones in the churchyard now. Barbara pressed her hand against her swollen belly 7 months along, the baby active and strong. In January, she would give birth. In a cabin she couldn't heat, with no one to help. The sound of hoofbeats brought her head up. Ezekiel Hammer rode into the farmyard on his gray mare, sitting his saddle with the rigid posture of a man who had learned to ride before he learned to walk. 67 years old, white-bearded, former militia captain, He had fought in the War of 1812. He had survived Indian raids as a child. He had buried 2 sons at Cheat Mountain in the same battle that wounded Samuel. Hammer was the authority on survival in these mountains. When he spoke, people listened. He dismounted and surveyed her woodpile without greeting. His eyes moved to the cabin, cataloging the gaps in the chinking, the lean to the foundation, the inadequate shelter for the livestock. His expression never changed. "Mrs. Jones," he said finally, "I've wintered in these mountains 67 years. I've seen the Kanawha freeze solid enough to drive a wagon across. I've seen men die standing at their posts, frozen stiff before they could cry out. I've seen wolves walk right into cabins because the families inside were too weak from cold to lift a rifle." He pointed at her woodpile. "You have 3 cords of wood, maybe 3.5 if I'm generous. You need 6 minimum to survive the winter, 8 to be safe. And that cabin," he gestured at the gaps in the walls, "that cabin has holes I can see daylight through. The wind will cut through there like it's not even there." Barbara said nothing. She had done the same calculations 100 times. Hammer's eyes dropped to her belly, then rose again. Something flickered across his face. Pity, maybe, or resignation. "You're in no condition to fix any of it," he said. "You can't cut 5 more cords of timber alone. You can't re-chink that cabin while carrying a child. And when that baby comes in the dead of winter with no one to help." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "Come to Staunton with my family," he said. "We leave in 2 weeks. The war can't last forever. You can come back in spring, start fresh." Barbara looked at the farm Samuel had built, the fields he had cleared, the cattle that represented their future, their children's future. Staunton was 60 miles away, over mountain roads that would be impassable within weeks. And even if she survived the journey, even if the baby survived, what would she return to? Raiders from both armies stripped abandoned farms to the bones. Everything Samuel had built would be gone. "I can't leave," she said. Hammer's jaw tightened. "Pride is a luxury you can't afford, Mrs. Jones." "It isn't pride. If I leave, I lose everything. The farm, the cattle, the only home my children have ever known. And the journey," she touched her belly again, "the journey might kill me, or the baby, or both. Staying will definitely kill you. Then I'll have to find another way." Hammer mounted his horse and looked down at her from the saddle. His face was hard now, all sympathy burned away. "There is no other way," he said. "I've survived 6 decades in these mountains because I know what's possible and what isn't. What you're proposing, wintering here alone, with children, in your condition, that isn't courage, Mrs. Jones. That's suicide dressed up as stubbornness." He gathered his reins. "When the real cold comes," he said, "and it always does, that cabin will be your coffin. God help you because no one else can." He rode away without looking back. Barbara watched him go. The first yellow leaves were falling from the oaks along the ridge, drifting down like warnings. 6 weeks until winter. 3 cords of wood. A cabin full of holes. A baby coming in January. The numbers didn't lie. Ezekiel Hammer was right about the math. But as Barbara turned back toward the cabin, her eyes drifted up toward the ridge where a dark opening marked the entrance to a limestone cave. A cave she had explored as a child with her father, who had been surveying stone for a building project in Lewisburg. She remembered something he had said, standing in that cool darkness while summer blazed outside. "These caves stay the same temperature summer and winter, 50-some degrees, always. The earth keeps them warm." 50 degrees wasn't warm, but it wasn't freezing either. A wild idea began to form. 3 days later, Barbara stood at the entrance to the cave, a tallow candle in one hand, and her father's words echoing in her memory. The opening gaped before her, 8 feet wide, 6 feet high, like a mouth in the mountainside. Cool air flowed out steadily, carrying the mineral smell of limestone and the faint sound of dripping water from somewhere deep within. She stepped inside. The temperature changed immediately. The September heat faded as if she had passed through an invisible curtain. Within 20 feet, the air felt like October, cool and still, with none of the humidity that made summer nights oppressive. Barbara held up her candle and moved deeper. The main chamber opened before her, vast enough that her small flame couldn't reach the ceiling. She estimated 40 feet wide, 60 feet deep, maybe 15 feet high at the center. The floor was relatively flat. Generations of water had smoothed the limestone into gentle undulations. Along the left wall, a natural passage led to a secondary chamber, narrower but still substantial. And there, in that secondary chamber, she found what sealed her decision: a small pool of water, fed by a spring seeping through the rock. Fresh water, underground, flowing year-round. She sat down on a limestone shelf and began to calculate. The cave maintained a constant temperature of roughly 52 to 55 degrees. That was cold, uncomfortable cold. But cattle could survive 50 degrees indefinitely with adequate food. So could humans, with blankets and body heat. The cave required no firewood. None. The earth itself provided insulation that no cabin could match. And unlike her cabin in the valley, the cave was hidden, a single entrance that could be blocked and defended. Raiders sweeping through the countryside would find nothing but an abandoned farm. They couldn't requisition cattle they couldn't find. Barbara worked through the logic step by step. She would build a stone wall across the entrance, leaving a gap for access covered by a hide flap. The wall would block wind and hide the interior glow of any fire. She would construct a raised wooden platform for sleeping, 18 inches off the cold stone floor, covered with straw and quilts. The livestock would occupy the secondary chamber, separated by a partition. She could move her hay and grain stores underground, safe from weather and raiders alike. The technical challenges were real but solvable. Ventilation. The cave had its own natural draft, air flowing steadily from deeper chambers toward the entrance. If she placed her cook fire near the entrance, the smoke would carry outward rather than filling the space. Water. The cave spring solved that problem entirely. Light, tallow candles, and small fires. The darkness would be oppressive, but darkness never killed anyone. The more Barbara thought, the more the plan crystallized. She wasn't fighting winter with fire, that was the conventional approach, and she didn't have enough fuel to win that fight. Instead, she would use the earth itself as insulation. The cave was a natural bunker, maintaining 54 degrees whether the outside temperature was 90 or -10. She climbed back to the surface and found Martha Kincaid waiting at the cave entrance. Martha was 42, a widow herself. Her husband had been killed by bushwhackers in the spring, shot dead in his own field for the horse he was plowing with. She had survived by being practical, trading with whichever army happened to pass through, making herself useful to whoever held power. She was carrying a basket of eggs, her currency for the endless negotiations that kept her alive. "Heard you were poking around up here," Martha said. "What's in the cave, Gold?" Barbara told her. "The whole plan, start to finish." Martha's expression shifted from curiosity to disbelief to something that looked almost like fear. "You've lost your mind," she said. "The grief's gotten to you." "The grief has nothing to do with it. The numbers do. I can't heat that cabin through winter with 3 cords of wood. I can't cut more in my condition. And I can't leave. The journey would kill me or the baby, and I'd lose everything we own. So your solution is to live underground, like an animal? Animals survive every winter, Martha. Cave damp will rot your lungs. You'll all sicken. And what about cooking? You light a fire in there, the smoke will choke you before it warms you." Barbara explained the ventilation, the natural draft, the placement of the fire near the entrance, the way the air moved through the limestone chambers. Martha shook her head. "And the children?" "Children need sunlight, Barbara. They'll weaken without it. They'll get sick. Children need food and warmth and safety. I can provide those underground. Sunlight can wait until spring." "What happens when your time comes? You're going to birth that baby on cold stone in the dark? No midwife, no help?" "Women have birthed babies in worse conditions since time began. I'll manage." Martha set down her egg basket and gripped Barbara by the shoulders. Her hands were rough and strong, the hands of a woman who had worked every day of her life. "Listen to me," she said. I've watched you lose your husband. I've watched you hold this farm together alone for a year. I know you're strong. But this isn't strength, Barbara. This is desperation pretending to be a plan. You're not saving your children. You're burying them early. Barbara pulled away gently. Maybe you're right, she said. Maybe the cave will fail and we'll die underground. But if I stay in that cabin, we'll definitely die. And if I leave for Staunton, we'll lose everything and probably die anyway. The cave is the only chance I have. Martha picked up her basket. I'll pray for you, she said, but I won't be joining you in that hole. She walked away down the ridge, and Barbara began taking measurements. Word spread fast in a place where nothing much happened. By the end of September, everyone who remained in the upper valley knew that the Jones widow was preparing to winter in a cave like some kind of deranged hermit. Most shook their heads and muttered about grief madness. A few quietly admired her stubbornness while expecting her to fail. None offered to help. Then Sergeant Hiram Cobb arrived. Barbara saw the dust first, riders on the valley road, moving purposefully toward her farm. She counted 3 horses, Confederate uniforms. The lead rider carried a satchel that could only contain one thing: requisition orders. She met them in the farmyard, Thomas standing behind her with his jaw set and his fists clenched. 12 years old enough to be conscripted if the armies got desperate enough, already doing a man's work on half a man's rations. Cobb dismounted and removed his hat. He was perhaps 30, clean-shaven, with the officious manner of a man who had found his calling in paperwork and quotas. His uniform was too clean. He hadn't seen real fighting. Mrs. Jones, he said, I'm Sergeant Hiram Cobb, Quartermaster's Corps. I have orders to requisition livestock for the Confederate Army. Every farm in this district owes a quota. He produced a paper from his satchel and ran his finger down a list. According to my records, this farm should have approximately 20 head of cattle. I'm authorized to take 8. Your records are wrong, Barbara said. My husband is dead, Sergeant. He died fighting for the Confederacy at Cheat Mountain. Your colleagues requisitioned 4 head in July. I have 14 cattle remaining. 8 would leave me 6 head to feed my children through winter. 6 head won't last until spring. Cobb's expression didn't change. Ma'am, I've heard variations of that story at every farm in this valley. The army has to eat. Your husband knew what he was fighting for. His sacrifice doesn't exempt his widow from contribution. Contribution? You're asking me to give you more than half of everything I have left. I'm not asking, Mrs. Jones. Barbara felt Thomas move forward and laid a hand on his arm. The boy was trembling with rage, but rage wouldn't help here. Rage would get him shot or conscripted or both. 2 head, she said. Take 2. That leaves me 12 to survive the winter. Take more than that, and you'll be requisitioning from corpses come spring. Cobb studied her for a long moment. His eyes dropped to her belly, rose to her face, moved to Thomas behind her. 4, he said finally. I can justify 4 in my report, but I'll be back before the first snow to collect what's owed, the full quota, and if I find... He paused, choosing his words. If I find that you've hidden livestock from the army, it will go hard for you. That's not a request, Mrs. Jones. That's theft from the Confederacy. His soldiers cut 4 head from her herd and drove them down the valley road. Barbara watched them go, doing the math in her head. 14 minus 4, 10 cattle remaining, not enough to sustain the farm if she stayed in the cabin, not even close, but maybe enough if she didn't have to feed the fire. The cave work began in earnest on the first day of October. Barbara and Thomas climbed to the ridge at dawn, leaving Mary to tend the chickens and watch the valley road for riders. The entrance wall had to be built first. Without it, the cave would be useless. Wind would cut through. Animals would wander out. The interior would be visible from the ridge trail. The construction plan was simple. Dry stone wall 4 feet high, spanning the 8-foot entrance. Leave a 4-foot gap on one side for access, covered by a hide flap. Nothing structural, nothing that required mortar or skills she didn't possess. Just stones stacked carefully, each one braced against its neighbors. The labor was anything but simple. Thomas handled the heavy lifting, limestone chunks from the creek bed a quarter mile away, some weighing 40 or 50 pounds. He carried them on his back, making trip after trip while the October sun beat down and the muscles in his legs burned and his shoulders purpled with bruises. Barbara worked with him when she could, carrying smaller stones of 15 or 20 pounds. Her back ached constantly. Her ankles swelled until her shoes left red marks. The baby kicked against her ribs with every strenuous movement, as if protesting the labor. By the end of the first day, they had the foundation laid, a row of heavy stones marking where the wall would rise. By the end of the third day, the wall stood 3 feet high across half the entrance. By the end of the fifth day, they had 4 feet of wall spanning the full 8 feet. On the sixth day, Barbara retrieved the deer hide from her smokehouse, the last buck Samuel had shot, its skin scraped and treated and stored against future need. She cut it into a flap large enough to cover the gap they had left in the wall. When it hung in place, swaying slightly in the cave's draft, the entrance looked like nothing more than a dark shadow on the mountainside. Inside, the work continued. The sleeping platform required lumber, more lumber than Barbara had on hand. She made a decision that felt like cutting off a limb. She would dismantle the smokehouse. The boards and beams that Samuel had carefully fitted together would become the foundation of their underground survival. Thomas and Barbara pulled the smokehouse apart over 2 days, salvaging every nail, every board, every usable scrap of wood. The preserved meat inside went into barrels and baskets for transport to the cave. The building that had stood for 7 years became a pile of lumber and a hole in the ground. On day 10, the sleeping platform took shape inside the cave, 8 feet by 10 feet, raised 18 inches off the cold stone floor on salvaged legs. Straw bedding covered the surface, precious straw that would otherwise have gone to the livestock. But humans needed insulation from the limestone more than cattle needed soft bedding. Mary climbed onto the platform that evening and curled up under a quilt. "It's warmer here than in the cabin," she said. "I can't feel the wind." Barbara realized her daughter was right. The platform, the cave, the stone walls, they had created a space where 54 degrees felt almost comfortable compared to the drafty cabin where wind knifed through every crack. Day 12 brought the first hard frost. Barbara stood at the cave entrance and watched her breath turn to vapor. The temperature had dropped into the low 20s overnight. Not winter cold, not yet, but a warning. The mountains were remembering what season was coming. She had perhaps 3 weeks until the first real snow. Cobb had promised to return before then to collect his quota. The hay still sat in her barn, 2,000 pounds of it, enough to feed 12 cattle for roughly 4 months if they ate sparingly. It had to be moved underground before Cobb came back, before the snow made the ridge trail impassable. She had her mare hitched to a makeshift sled within the hour. The first load of hay weighed perhaps 200 pounds. Barbara packed it as tightly as she could, securing it with rope, and led the mare up the ridge trail, while Thomas stayed behind to load the next batch. The mare was old and tired, protesting the weight with each step, but she was steady. 8 trips that day. 1,600 pounds of hay moved from barn to cave. Barbara's hands cracked and bled from the rope work. Her back screamed with every step. She ate standing up, too exhausted to sit, knowing that sitting would mean not getting up again. Day 14. Day 15. The hay was finally underground, stacked in the secondary chamber where the livestock would live. The grain followed, sacks of corn and oats that would supplement the hay through the coldest months. But hay and grain were only part of the equation. The animals themselves still stood in the valley, visible to any rider who passed by, a target for Cobb's requisition or any raider who happened through. They had to be moved. At night, without being seen. The temperature dropped again on October 20th. Frost lay thick on the ground when Barbara shook Thomas awake in the darkness before dawn. "Tonight," she said. "We move the cattle tonight." Thomas looked at her with the hollow eyes of exhaustion. He was 12 years old. He had done more work in 3 weeks than most boys did in a year. His hands were blistered, his shoulders bruised, his body running on willpower alone. "How many trips?" he asked. 3. 4 cattle at a time. We can't manage more in the dark." "What about the hogs, the chickens?" "Mary will handle the chickens tomorrow. Baskets with covers." The hogs, Barbara paused. Hogs were stubborn, noisy, nearly impossible to drive quietly in darkness. The hogs go last. We'll need luck. Thomas nodded and pulled on his boots. The first trip began at midnight. Barbara led the way with a shuttered lantern, its light reduced to a sliver that barely illuminated the trail. Thomas followed with 4 cattle on lead ropes, speaking softly to them, keeping them calm through sheer force of will. The ridge trail was treacherous in darkness, loose stones, roots, sudden drops where the path curved. One wrong step, and a cow could break a leg. One panicked bellow could alert anyone within a mile. But Thomas had grown up with these cattle. He knew their temperaments, their fears, their stubbornness. He talked to them like old friends, guiding them around obstacles, soothing them when they balked. They reached the cave at 2 a.m. Barbara directed the cattle into the secondary chamber while Thomas collapsed against the stone wall, breathing hard. 3 more trips, Barbara said. I know. They returned to the farm and did it again. Dawn was breaking when the last of the cattle entered the cave, 12 head, all that remained after Cobb's requisition. Barbara stood at the cave entrance and looked down at her farm in the valley. The barn stood empty. The pasture held nothing but frost-covered grass. The hogs remained, the chickens remained, but from a distance the farm looked abandoned. That afternoon, Martha Kincaid appeared on the ridge trail. Barbara heard her coming and grabbed Samuel's rifle, positioning herself at the cave entrance. But it was Martha's familiar voice that called out, "Don't shoot, Barbara. I come in peace, if not in agreement." Martha climbed into view, breathing hard from the steep trail. She carried a cloth-wrapped bundle and wore an expression that mixed disapproval with something Barbara couldn't name. "I'm not saying you're right," Martha said. "I still think this is madness, but no Christian woman should watch her neighbor labor alone in her condition." She handed Barbara the bundle, fresh bread, still warm, preserved apples from her own diminishing stores, a small pot of honey. "What do you want for this?" Barbara asked. Nothing was free anymore. "I want you to survive long enough to admit I was right. And if you do survive," Martha looked past her into the cave's darkness. "If that hole actually keeps you alive through winter, I want to know how you did it." She helped move the last of the cattle into the secondary chamber. She helped Barbara reinforce the hide flap against the growing wind. She worked without complaint, her practical hands accomplishing in hours what would have taken Barbara days. When they finished, Martha paused at the cave entrance. "Cobb was in Marlinton yesterday," she said, "asking about missing livestock. Someone told him you've been hauling supplies up the ridge. He knows something's happening here." Barbara's stomach tightened. "How long before he comes?" "Tomorrow, maybe. Day after at the latest. 24 hours. Maybe 48. And the hogs were still in the valley." "You should go," Barbara said. "If Cobb finds you here, it won't go well for either of us." Martha hesitated, then nodded. But before she left, she said, "That offer you made, about the cave having room if I need shelter. It still stands. I won't need it, but—" She didn't finish the sentence. Barbara watched her disappear down the trail, then turned to Thomas. "We move the hogs tonight," she said, "before Cobb arrives." Thomas looked at the darkening sky. The first flakes of snow were beginning to fall, light, scattered, but unmistakably winter. "It's going to be a bad one, Ma," he said. "I know." The hogs did not want to move. Barbara had expected stubbornness. She had not expected the old boar to balk completely at the ridge trail entrance, planting his hooves and refusing to take another step, regardless of prodding, pulling, or cursing. Thomas tried everything: grain trails, rope leads, sheer physical force. The boar was 400 pounds of obstinacy, and he had decided that mountainsides in the dark were not his chosen path. The snow was falling harder now. An inch accumulated while they struggled. Finally, Barbara remembered something her father had told her about driving hogs. "They follow their bellies," he'd said. "You can lead a hog anywhere if it thinks food is at the other end." She took a bucket of kitchen scraps, potato peelings, apple cores, stale bread, and let the boar see her carry it up the trail. Then she set it just out of his sight around the first bend. The boar's snout twitched. He smelled the slops. His stubbornness warred with his appetite. Appetite won. He followed the bucket up the trail, grunting and snorting, with the sows and piglets trailing behind. Thomas drove them from behind with a switch, keeping them moving whenever the boar wanted to stop and investigate every shadow. They reached the cave at 3 in the morning. Snow covered the ground 2 inches deep. The temperature had dropped into the teens. Barbara penned the hogs in a corner of the secondary chamber, separated from the cattle by a hastily constructed barrier of stones and salvaged boards. The cave smelled now like a barn, animal sweat and manure and hay. But it was warm, 54 degrees warm, while outside the world turned white and frozen. Dawn came gray and heavy with clouds. More snow on the way. Barbara descended to the farm one last time to collect the final items: quilts, her Bible, Samuel's rifle, the last of the cooking implements, her small store of medicines and herbs. She worked quickly, loading everything onto the mare's sled, glancing constantly at the valley road. She was cinching the final rope when she saw it. Dust on the road. Riders. At least 3 horses moving fast. Cobb. Barbara's heart slammed against her ribs. She had perhaps 15 minutes before they reached the farm, maybe less. She abandoned the careful loading, throwing the remaining items onto the sled without securing them. The mare protested, sensing her panic, but responded to the desperate slap on her hindquarters. They scrambled up the ridge trail, Barbara leading, the sled bouncing and sliding behind. Quilts fell off, and she left them. The Bible slipped from its perch, and she grabbed it mid-fall. The rifle she clutched in her free hand, its weight both reassurance and warning. Halfway up the trail, her foot caught on a root. Barbara went down hard on her knees. Pain shot through her legs and her belly, and for one horrible moment she felt the baby shift and twist in a way that didn't feel right. Thomas was there instantly, pulling her up. "Ma, are you... Keep moving." She forced herself forward, ignoring the pain, ignoring the cramping sensation that might be nothing or might be disaster. The cave entrance loomed ahead, the hide flap fluttering in the wind. They made it inside just as she heard, distantly, voices from the farm below. Barbara collapsed against the stone wall, her lungs burning, her body screaming, her hands pressed against her belly. The baby moved, a strong kick, then another, still alive, still there. Thomas peered out through a gap in the hide flap. "They're at the cabin," he whispered. 3 soldiers. Cobb is yelling at someone." Barbara forced herself to breathe. The contractions, if that's what they were, began to fade. False labor, she told herself. Just stress and exertion, not real labor, not yet. "What do they see?" she asked. "Empty barn, empty pasture. They're searching the cabin now." A pause. "One of them is pointing up at the ridge." Barbara's blood went cold. "Can they see the cave?" "I don't..." Thomas squinted. "No, the entrance is dark against the rock. They can't see it from down there, but the trail shows footprints in the snow." Footprints, leading directly from the farm to the cave. Barbara closed her eyes. If Cobb followed those prints, if he climbed the ridge and found the cave, found the hidden livestock, the charge would be theft from the Confederacy. She could be arrested. The cattle would be seized. The children would be alone. Minutes passed. Barbara listened to Thomas's whispered commentary. "They're arguing about something. Cobb is pointing at the ridge again. The other 2 are shaking their heads." A pause. "It's snowing harder. The prints are filling in." Barbara looked up. Fat flakes of snow were falling through the gap in the hide flap, accumulating on the stone floor. 1 inch since dawn, 2 inches by now, and falling faster. "They're mounting up," Thomas said. His voice cracked with relief. "They're leaving, heading back down the valley." Barbara let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. The snow had saved them. Another hour and their tracks would be buried. Another day and the ridge trail might be impassable. She looked around the cave, at the cattle lowing softly in the secondary chamber, at Mary arranging their meager possessions on the sleeping platform, at Thomas slumping against the entrance wall with exhaustion. They had done it. They had moved everything and everyone underground before Cobb could find them. They had food, water, shelter, and livestock. They had survived the preparation, but as Barbara pressed her hand against her belly, feeling the baby stir within, she knew the truth. The hardest part was still coming. October became November. The snow kept falling. Inside the cave, Barbara established the rhythms that would govern their survival. Wake before dawn, tend the fire, feed the livestock, milk the cows that were still giving, collect eggs from the chickens, fewer now as the birds adjusted to the darkness. Cook breakfast, school the children, maintain the camp, tend the fire, sleep, wake, repeat. The monotony was crushing. The darkness was worse. Even with candles burning and the fire lit near the entrance, the cave remained a world of shadows. Limestone walls that never changed, a ceiling that vanished into black, the constant sound of dripping water and animal breathing and wind moaning past the hide flap. Mary stopped talking by the third week. She did her chores mechanically, ate when told, slept curled in a tight ball on the platform. Barbara watched her daughter retreating into some interior place and felt powerless to reach her. Thomas bore it better, or hid it better. He worked from dawn to dark, managing the animals, hauling water, gathering firewood from the limited supply of deadfall on the ridge. But Barbara saw the way his eyes sought the entrance whenever the hide flap moved. He was hungry for daylight. They all were. Ezekiel Hammer appeared on November 15th. Barbara heard him coming, the crunch of boots on snow, the heavy breathing of an old man climbing a steep trail. She had the rifle ready when his voice called out, "Mrs. Jones, it's Hammer. I'm alone." He pushed through the hide flap, snow falling from his shoulders, and stopped dead at the sight before him. The cave was alive. Cattle stood in rows in the secondary chamber, visible through the partition. Chickens roosted on perches. Hogs grunted in their pen. A fire crackled near the entrance, its smoke drawing steadily outward. Children slept on a raised platform. And Barbara Jones sat beside that fire, 8.5 months pregnant, mending a shirt by candlelight. Hammer took off his hat. "I'll grant you this, Mrs. Jones," he said slowly. "You've done something I'd have said was impossible. You said the damp would kill us faster than any raider. I did say that. We're still alive." Hammer moved deeper into the cave, studying the construction, the stone wall, the ventilation pattern, the livestock arrangement. His face was unreadable. "Warmer than my cabin," he admitted. "I'll grant you that. But winter hasn't truly come yet, Mrs. Jones. We've had snow and cold, but not the real cold. The January freeze is coming, 20, 30 below. Wind chills that freeze a man's breath in his lungs. That's when we'll see if this cave of yours is salvation or a grave." He looked at her belly. "And birthing a baby underground in the cold and dark, with no midwife, no doctor, I've seen strong women die in childbirth in warm beds surrounded by help. You'll be alone." "I won't be alone," Barbara said. "Thomas knows what to do. I've taught him." A 12-year-old boy playing midwife. Women have done more with less. Hammer shook his head but said nothing. He stayed an hour, warming himself by the fire, watching the system Barbara had created. When he left, he paused at the entrance. "I hope you're right," he said. "I truly do. But when the real test comes, and it will come, warmth isn't everything." Barbara watched him descend the trail, his dark figure disappearing into the white landscape. The real test. She pressed her hands against her belly, feeling the baby shift and roll. 8.5 months, maybe 3 weeks until her time came. Outside, the clouds were building again. The temperature was dropping. Martha had sent word through her hired man that a major storm was brewing, the worst in years, he said. Old-timers could feel it in their bones. Barbara added wood to the fire and watched the flames dance. The real test was coming, and she had no idea if she was ready. December brought the first real cold. Barbara woke on the morning of December 10th to find ice crystals forming on the hide flap. She checked the fire, still burning, still drawing properly, and then checked the temperature outside by holding her hand through the gap. The cold bit into her skin like teeth. She pulled on her heaviest coat and stepped outside the cave entrance. The world had turned crystalline overnight. Every tree branch was sheathed in ice. The snow crunched underfoot with that peculiar squeak that meant temperatures well below freezing. Back inside, she checked on the livestock. The cattle stood calmly in the secondary chamber, breath steaming in the relative warmth. 53 degrees by her reckoning, cold enough to see your breath, but nothing like the knife-edged air outside. The system was working. Her hay stores worried her more. The cattle were eating faster than she had anticipated. Stressed by the unfamiliar environment, they consumed more to maintain body heat even in the cave's moderate temperature. Her original estimate of 4 months' supply was optimistic. 3 months, maybe. Possibly less. February could be a problem, but February was a lifetime away. First, she had to survive January. The baby had dropped in the last week. Barbara felt the difference in her body, the pressure low in her pelvis, the slightly easier breathing, the way she walked now with her legs farther apart. Her mother had told her that babies dropped a few weeks before birth. It was the body preparing. She was ready as she could be. Clean cloth stacked near the sleeping platform, a knife sterilized in flame, twine for tying the cord. A pot of water kept constantly warm by the fire. She had walked Thomas through the process twice, watching his face pale but his jaw set with determination. "When the time comes," she told him, "you do what I tell you. Nothing more, nothing less." "Can you do that?" "Yes, Ma." "Even if it's frightening?" "Yes, Ma." She believed him. She had to believe him. Christmas arrived with a brief warming, temperatures in the 20s, almost balmy compared to the week before. Barbara read the nativity story by candlelight while the children listened. Mary asked the question that had been forming in Barbara's mind for weeks. "Did Mary have her baby in a cave, Ma? Like us?" "Close enough," Barbara said. "A stable, they say. But stables in that country were often caves cut into hillsides. The inns were full, so they found shelter underground." "And the baby was born there?" "The baby was born there." Mary was quiet for a moment. Then, "So we're like them, hiding underground, waiting." Barbara pulled her daughter close. "We're exactly like them." The warmth didn't last. On December 28th, the temperature plummeted. Barbara stepped outside at dawn and felt the cold slam into her like a physical blow. Her lungs burned with every breath. The moisture in her nose froze instantly. She didn't have a thermometer, but she knew cold. This was below zero. Well below. The cattle sensed it too. They huddled together in the secondary chamber, their bodies pressed close, their breath creating clouds of vapor that hung in the still air. The chickens had stopped laying entirely, the stress of the cold penetrating even the cave's insulation. December the 29th brought clouds building from the northwest. Barbara watched them mass on the horizon, gray and heavy, pregnant with snow. The barometric pressure was dropping. She could feel it in her joints, in the ache that spread through her hips and lower back. Old Hammer's hired man appeared at the cave entrance that evening, half frozen, bearing a message. "Mr. Hammer says to tell you there's a storm coming," he gasped, warming his hands by the fire. "Worst he's seen in 60 years, he says. 3 days at least, maybe more. He says..." The man hesitated. "He says what?" "He says stay underground and pray." The man left before full dark, hurrying back down the ridge while the trail was still passable. Barbara watched him go, then turned to look at the clouds swallowing the western sky. 3 days. Maybe more. She pressed her hand against her belly. The baby had been quiet all day, resting, gathering strength. Her back ached in that low, persistent way that she remembered from her previous pregnancies. "Not yet," she thought. "Please, not yet. Wait until the storm passes." But babies didn't wait. Babies came when they were ready. The blizzard struck on December 31st, 1862, the last day of a year that had taken everything from Barbara Jones, except her children and her stubbornness. Wind slammed into the ridge with enough force to shake loose stones from the cave entrance wall. Snow drove horizontally, so thick that Barbara couldn't see 3 feet beyond the hide flap. The temperature dropped through the teens, through single digits, towards 0 and below. By midnight, the world had vanished into white chaos. Inside the cave, the fire crackled steadily. The hide flap bulged and snapped with each gust, but held. The temperature remained constant, 54 degrees, warm as a summer evening compared to the hell outside. Barbara sat on the sleeping platform, unable to sleep, listening to the storm's howl. Thomas had finally dozed off after tending the livestock. Mary slept curled against her brother, her breathing deep and even. At 2 a.m. on January 1st, 1863, Barbara's water broke. She felt the warm rush of fluid, followed immediately by a contraction that wrapped around her belly like a vice. The pain was familiar. She had done this twice before, but the circumstances were anything but. She woke Thomas with a hand on his shoulder. "It's time," she said. His eyes went wide in the candlelight. For a moment he looked every bit the terrified 12-year-old he was. Then something shifted in his face, and he became something older. "What do I do?" he asked. "Boil water. Keep the fire burning. Bring the clean cloths. And stay calm. Can you do that?" "Yes, Ma." The contractions came faster than Barbara remembered. An hour passed, then 2. She walked the cave floor, pacing between the fire and the sleeping platform, breathing through the pain as her mother had taught her. The storm outside seemed to intensify with each contraction, as if nature itself was laboring alongside her. Thomas kept the water hot. He brought cloths when she asked. He held her hand during the worst of it, his grip surprisingly strong. At 3:30, the labor stalled. Barbara had been pushing for nearly an hour. The baby should have descended by now, should have moved down and out, following the path that nature had designed. Instead, nothing. Pressure without progress. Pain without purpose. She knew what this meant. She had heard the stories from her mother, from the women in her church. Babies positioned wrong. Babies stuck. Babies that killed their mothers because they couldn't find their way out. "Ma," Thomas's voice was tight with fear. "Ma, what's wrong?" Barbara forced herself to breathe. Panic would kill them both, her and the baby. "Help me up," she said. Thomas pulled her to her feet. Her legs shook. The contraction that ripped through her nearly drove her back to her knees. "What are you doing?" Thomas asked. "Walking. Sometimes it helps turn the baby." They walked, around the fire, past the sleeping Mary, along the stone wall, back again. Barbara paused with each contraction, leaning on Thomas, breathing through clenched teeth. The baby shifted inside her. She felt it move, twist, resist. On the 5th circuit, something changed. The pressure shifted lower. The baby's position adjusted, not fully, but enough. Barbara felt the familiar urge to push, stronger now, more insistent. "The platform," she gasped. "Help me to the platform." Thomas guided her back. Barbara found herself squatting on the straw bedding, her back against the limestone wall, her body doing what bodies had done since the beginning of time. Thomas positioned himself in front of her, his face pale but steady. Mary had woken and huddled in the corner, eyes wide, watching. "I can see it," Thomas said, his voice cracking. "I can see the head." Barbara pushed. The pain was beyond description, a tearing, burning, all-consuming force that left no room for thought. She screamed once, the sound swallowed by the storm's howl, pushed again and again. At 5:17 in the morning on January 1st, 1863, a baby boy slipped into Thomas's waiting hands. He didn't cry. 3 seconds. 5. Barbara's heart stopped. The baby lay still in Thomas's trembling grasp, blue-tinged, silent. "Clear his mouth," Barbara gasped. "Your finger. Clear his mouth and nose." Thomas obeyed, scooping mucus from the baby's airway with a finger that looked enormous against that tiny face. The baby coughed, drew a breath, and wailed. The sound echoed through the limestone chamber, bouncing off walls that had stood for millennia. A new life, announcing itself to an indifferent universe, a cry of protest and arrival and raw, determined existence. Barbara took the baby from Thomas's shaking hands. William Samuel Jones, named for her father and her husband, born underground in a cave during the worst blizzard in memory, attended by a 12-year-old boy and witnessed by his 9-year-old sister. She tied the cord with twine, cut it with the sterilized knife, wrapped the baby in warm cloth. William nursed for the first time while the storm raged outside. The crisis wasn't over. At 6 a.m, with Barbara barely recovered from the birth and William nursing against her chest, Thomas heard something that didn't belong. "Ma!" His voice was sharp with alarm. "Ma, there's someone outside." Barbara's blood ran cold. Raiders, soldiers. Who would be out in a blizzard that had already killed men where they stood? Thomas moved to the cave entrance, pulling aside the hide flap just enough to peer out. Dawn was breaking, though the storm made it hard to tell. Gray light filtered through driving snow, illuminating a world of white violence. "I see someone," Thomas said. "In the snow. They're not moving." Barbara's mind raced. A Confederate patrol? One of Cobb's men? A deserter? How far? 50 yards, maybe less. They fell. They're not getting up. Barbara looked at the baby in her arms, at Mary huddled by the fire, at Thomas standing by the entrance with snow already coating his shoulders. "Close the flap," she said. "We can't help them." Thomas didn't move. His face was working, struggling with something she couldn't read. "Ma," he said slowly, "I think it's Mrs. Kincaid." Martha. Barbara closed her eyes. Martha, who had doubted her. Martha, who had helped her anyway. Martha, who had offered nothing but criticism and then provided bread and honey and labor when Barbara needed it most. Martha was dying 50 yards from salvation. "Thomas," Barbara said. "Thomas, look at me." He turned. His eyes were wet. "If you go out there, you might not make it back. The wind, the cold. You could get lost in 20 feet. You could freeze before you reach her." "I know, Ma. I can't come with you. I can barely stand. If something happens to you out there, there's nothing I can do." "I know." "Mary can't help. She's 9 years old. She can barely keep the fire burning." "I know, Ma." Barbara saw it in his face, the decision already made. He wasn't asking permission. He was saying goodbye, just in case. "Take the rope," she said. "Tie one end here to the stone wall. Pay it out as you go. If you get turned around, follow it back." Thomas nodded. He grabbed a coil of rope from their supplies, tied one end to a jutting stone near the entrance, and wrapped the other end around his waist. "Keep Mary safe," he said. "Keep William safe." Then he pushed through the hide flap and disappeared into the white. The rope paid out slowly, foot by foot, as Thomas fought his way into the storm. Barbara held the loose coils in her hand, feeling each tug and pull, trying to track his progress through the vibrations in the hemp. 20 feet, 30. The rope jerked hard, Thomas slipping, catching himself. 40 feet, 50. The rope went slack. Barbara's heart stopped. She waited, counting heartbeats. 1, 2, 3. The rope tightened again, began to move back toward the cave. Slowly. So slowly. Mary was crying by the fire. William was crying in Barbara's arms. The storm was screaming past the cave entrance. And somewhere in that chaos, a 12-year-old boy was dragging a grown woman through snow deep enough to bury them both. 5 minutes passed. 10. Barbara had given up counting when the hide flap exploded inward, and Thomas staggered through, half falling, dragging Martha Kincaid's limp form behind him. Martha's face was white. Her lips were blue. Ice coated her hair, her clothes, her skin. She wasn't shivering. Barbara knew that was bad. When the shivering stopped, death was close. "Fire!" Barbara gasped. "Get her near the fire. Blankets. All of them." Thomas was shaking so badly he could barely stand. His ears were white with frostbite. His fingers were clumsy, wooden. Mary moved first, 9 years old, traumatized by the night, but moving. She grabbed blankets from the platform and dragged them to where Martha lay. She began stripping the frozen clothing from Martha's body. Wet cloth would kill as surely as cold. Barbara couldn't help. Her legs wouldn't support her, but she could direct. Wrap her. The wool blankets first, then the quilts. Put stones near the fire to warm, then put them around her. Mary, good girl. Keep going. Thomas, sit down before you collapse. Sit near the fire. Get your hands warm. The children obeyed. Martha lay motionless by the fire, wrapped in every blanket they had, surrounded by warming stones. Her breathing was shallow but present. Her pulse, when Barbara finally managed to check it, was weak but steady. She would live. Probably. If infection didn't take her fingers and toes. Why? Thomas asked, his voice cracked and broken. Why was she out in the storm? Barbara didn't know, but she could guess. Martha's cabin, Martha's stubborn refusal to take shelter with Barbara. Raiders didn't care about blizzards. If anything, storms provided cover for their work. Bushwhackers, most likely, Barbara said, or deserters. They took everything and left her to die. So she came here. She came here. Thomas looked at his frostbitten hands, at the woman lying unconscious by the fire, at his mother holding his newborn brother in a cave underground. I couldn't just let her die, he said. No, Barbara agreed. You couldn't. The storm lasted 3 days. For 72 hours, the world outside ceased to exist. Wind and snow and killing cold dominated everything. Barbara drifted in and out of exhausted sleep, waking to nurse William, to check on Martha, to monitor the children. Thomas became the sole functioning adult in the cave. He maintained the fire. He carried water from the cave spring to the livestock. He fed the cattle and hogs. He checked Martha's breathing every hour. He changed the warming stones around her body. He did it all on 2 hours of sleep at a time, his frostbitten ears and fingers wrapped in cloth, his body running on something deeper than energy. On the second day, Martha regained consciousness. She couldn't speak at first. Her throat was too raw from the cold. But her eyes found Barbara's, and in them Barbara saw something she had never expected to see from Martha Kincaid: gratitude and shame. On the third day, the storm broke. Thomas pushed through the hide flap at dawn and stood blinking in brilliant sunlight. The sky was achingly blue. The wind had died completely. And the temperature was 8 degrees below zero. But Thomas wasn't looking at the thermometer in his head. He was looking at the valley below. Ma, he called, his voice strange. Ma, you need to see this. Barbara couldn't walk yet, but she could crawl, and she made it to the entrance, dragging herself upright against the stone wall to look out. The valley was a graveyard. Ezekiel Hammer's cattle lay scattered across his pasture, dark shapes against the white snow, frozen where they stood. 7 head, dead and stiff, ice coating their bodies. Farther down the valley, smoke rose from cabin chimneys, survivors huddled around dying fires, wondering if the storm had finally ended. But between those cabins, Barbara could see other shapes, other losses. The blizzard had killed half the livestock in the valley, maybe more. She turned back to look at the secondary chamber of the cave. Her cattle stood calmly in rows, chewing hay. Her hogs grunted in their pen. Her chickens clucked softly on their perches. 14 cattle, 6 hogs, 10 chickens, all alive. All alive because she had trusted a wild idea and a hole in a mountain. Thomas came to stand beside her. His face was gaunt with exhaustion, his ears blistered with frostbite, his hands bandaged and clumsy. He had aged 10 years in 3 days. We made it, Ma, he said. Barbara pulled him close with her free arm. The other still cradled William against her chest. We made it, she agreed. But she was looking at Hammer's frozen cattle and thinking about the conversation that was coming. Ezekiel Hammer appeared at the cave entrance on January 15th. He looked older than Barbara remembered. The storm had aged him too. Or maybe losing his cattle had carved something away from his foundation. He walked slowly up the ridge trail, stopping twice to catch his breath. Barbara met him at the entrance, William bundled in her arms. She had recovered enough to stand, to walk short distances, though the birth and the crisis had left her weaker than she wanted to admit. Hammer stopped at the stone wall and looked past her into the cave. He took in the scene slowly, the cattle standing healthy in the secondary chamber, the chickens on their perches, the hogs rooting in their pen. Martha Kincaid sitting by the fire, her frost-bitten feet wrapped in cloth, her face hollow but alive. He removed his hat. "Mrs. Jones," he said, "I've lived in these mountains all my life, 67 years. I've seen things that would turn most men's hair white, Indian raids, blizzards, wars, pestilence." He paused, seeming to search for words. "I've never been more wrong about anything in my life." Barbara said nothing. She waited. 7 head, Hammer continued. 7 of my 9 cattle, frozen dead in that shed I built 20 years ago. A shed that survived every winter I can remember. A shed that wasn't good enough. His voice cracked on the last word. My breeding stock, my future, gone. Frozen while I huddled by my fire and prayed for dawn. He looked at her cattle again. How many did you lose? None. None. The cave stayed 54 degrees through the whole storm. The animals never even knew there was a blizzard. Hammer was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was smaller. I told you the damp would kill you faster than any raider. I told you that cave would be your coffin. You did tell me that. I was wrong. He met her eyes. I've been wrong about a lot of things, Mrs. Jones. Stubborn wrong, proud wrong, the kind of wrong that gets people killed. He gestured at the cave. How did you know? How did you know this would work? Barbara thought about the question. The real answer was complicated, desperation, her father's words, the brutal math of survival. But there was a simpler answer too. I didn't know, she said. I calculated, I planned, I hoped, but I didn't know. I just knew that every other option would definitely fail. The cave was the only chance that might succeed. Hammer nodded slowly. The only chance that might succeed. He looked at the cave entrance, at the stone wall Barbara had built, at the hide flap swaying gently in the winter breeze. Would you teach me how you calculated the temperature, the ventilation, the livestock arrangement? Barbara blinked. You want to learn? I want to survive, Mrs. Jones. And it's become clear that what I knew about survival wasn't enough. He put his hat back on. I'll be back tomorrow with a notebook if I can find one that isn't frozen solid. He turned and began walking down the ridge trail. Halfway down, he stopped and called back. That boy of yours, Thomas. He saved Mrs. Kincaid's life. I know. He's going to be a good man. Already is, from what I can see. Hammer disappeared around the bend. Barbara stood in the cave entrance, holding her newborn son, watching the old man navigate the snow-covered trail. One skeptic converted. Martha Kincaid took longer. She spent 3 weeks in the cave, recovering from the hypothermia that had nearly killed her. Barbara gave her space, physically and emotionally. The woman who had called this plan madness was now living proof of its wisdom. In early February, Martha finally spoke about it. My cabin, she said. They were sitting near the fire, watching Thomas feed the cattle. They came during the storm, 4 men, deserters by the look of them. Confederate uniforms, but no discipline. They took everything, food, blankets, the last of my firewood, beat me when I tried to stop them. She touched her face. The bruises had faded to yellow and green. They left me outside, said anyone who wouldn't share didn't deserve shelter. I walked. I don't remember deciding to come here. I just walked, following something. Memory, maybe. The last place I knew would be warm. Barbara didn't respond. She had learned that Martha needed to tell the story at her own pace. I told you this was madness, Martha continued. I told you that you were burying your children early, that the damp would rot your lungs, that you couldn't cook underground without choking on smoke. She laughed bitterly. I thought I was practical. I thought trading with both sides, staying flexible, never committing, I thought that was how you survive. She looked around the cave, at the healthy cattle, the warm fire, the children sleeping peacefully on the platform. You showed me there's another way, not just survival through compromise, survival through, she searched for the word, through building something that works, something the war can't take from you. The war almost took it anyway, Barbara said. Those deserters could have come here instead of your cabin. But they didn't, and if they had, you had walls, a defensible position, something to fight for. Martha shook her head. I had nothing to fight for. That's why I lost. She was quiet for a moment. I'd like to stay, she said finally. Through the spring. Help with the farm in exchange for shelter. Learn how you built this place. You're welcome to stay as long as you need. And then Martha took a breath. There's a cave on the ridge above my property, smaller than this one, but similar. I've seen it for years and never thought anything of it, but now you're thinking about next winter. Now I'm thinking about next winter. Barbara smiled for the first time in days. 2 skeptics converted. Sergeant Hiram Cobb appeared in April. The snow had melted by then, revealing a valley ravaged by winter and war. Half the farms stood abandoned. The ones that remained were stripped to bare survival, no livestock, no reserves, no hope beyond the next season. Barbara saw him coming from the Ridge Trail lookout, a single figure on foot, no uniform, no soldiers at his back. She had the rifle ready when he reached the cave entrance. He looked nothing like the officious quartermaster who had threatened her in September. His clothes were civilian, torn and dirty. His face was gaunt. His left arm hung awkwardly, splinted with sticks and cloth. Mrs. Jones, he said. His voice was hoarse. I've come to throw myself on your mercy. Barbara kept the rifle trained on his chest. Last time you were here, you threatened to have me arrested for hiding livestock from the Confederacy. I did. I was following orders. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. The Confederacy doesn't have much use for orders anymore, at least not in this valley. Droop Mountain shattered my unit. I took a ball through my shoulder. The surgeon wanted to take my arm, but we didn't have enough chloroform for the operation, so I kept it. He swayed slightly, catching himself against the stone wall. I've been walking for 2 weeks. Deserting, I suppose, though there's nothing left to desert from. I came here because... He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. I came here because I heard what you did. Survived the blizzard. Saved Mrs. Kincaid. Kept your livestock when everyone else lost theirs. And what do you want? Shelter. For a few days. Until I can travel. I'm not asking... He held up his good hand. I'm not asking for charity. I can work. One-armed work, but work. And I have information. Intelligence. Troop movements. The Union cavalry unit sweeping through this valley in May. Barbara studied him. 6 months ago, this man had represented everything that threatened her family. The authority to seize, the power to punish, the machinery of war grinding civilian lives beneath its wheels. Now he was just a wounded man begging for help. She thought about what her husband would have done. Samuel had been a Confederate. He had believed in the cause enough to die for it. Would he have wanted her to help a deserter? But Samuel was dead. And Barbara had spent 6 months learning that survival didn't care about causes or sides or principles. Survival cared about what worked. 3 days, she said. You work while you're here, then you move on. Cobb nodded. Something that might have been tears glinted in his eyes. I threatened your family, he said. I was going to take your cattle, leave your children to starve. I remember. And you're helping me anyway. Barbara lowered the rifle. I'm not helping you, Sergeant. I'm surviving. That's all any of us are doing, and survival is easier when we don't spend our energy on revenge. She stepped back from the entrance. Come inside. You look like you're about to fall over. Cobb worked for 3 days, one-armed and exhausted. doing whatever tasks he could manage. He fed chickens. He carried water. He helped Thomas repair the entrance wall where winter had loosened stones. On the morning of the fourth day, before he left, he gave Barbara the information he had promised. Union cavalry, a full brigade. They'll sweep through in May, looking for Confederate sympathizers. If they find you here with Southern ties, your husband's service, his unit, the rumors about hidden livestock. What do you suggest? Keep your head down. Don't fly any flags. When they ask about your loyalties, tell them the truth. You're a widow trying to keep her children alive. Most officers will respect that. The ones who don't. He shrugged. The ones who don't are dangerous no matter what you say. He gathered his meager possessions and paused at the cave entrance. You showed me something, Mrs. Jones. Something I didn't think existed anymore. What's that? Mercy that isn't weakness. He touched his hat. I hope you survive whatever comes next. He walked down the ridge trail and disappeared into the valley. 3 skeptics converted, or at least transformed. Spring came late that year, as if winter was reluctant to release its grip on the mountains. But it came. Barbara led her cattle out of the cave on April 15th, 1863. 16 head now. 2 calves had been born in February, healthy and strong despite their underground birth. 6 hogs followed, soon to birth piglets. 8 chickens remained, enough to rebuild the flock by summer. She had more than she started with. Thomas walked beside her, no longer the child who had followed his father's coffin to the churchyard. 14 months of labor, of crisis, of impossible responsibility had forged him into something new. His hands were calloused. His shoulders were broad. His eyes held a steadiness that most men never achieved. Mary had found her voice again. The trauma of the winter had retreated as spring approached, replaced by something resilient. She chattered about planting gardens, about the new calves, about the baby brother who already seemed to recognize her face. And William. William was 4 months old, fat and healthy, utterly unaware that he had been born during a blizzard in a limestone cave. He would grow up hearing the story, but he would never fully understand what it meant. How could anyone who hadn't lived it? Martha Kincaid stayed through the spring, as promised. She helped rebuild what the winter had damaged, the cabin, the fences, the smokehouse Barbara planned to reconstruct. And when her strength returned, she began preparing her own cave for the following winter. It won't be as good as yours, she admitted. Smaller, less water, but it'll work. It'll work, Barbara agreed. Ezekiel Hammer visited regularly, notebook in hand, recording everything Barbara could teach him about underground survival. He was too old to winter in a cave himself. His joints couldn't take the constant chill. But he had grandchildren in Staunton, and letters traveled slowly, and information was the only inheritance he had left to give them. Write it down, Barbara told him. Everything we learned, so others don't have to figure it out alone. He did. Pages and pages of careful notes about temperature, ventilation, livestock management, food storage. A manual for survival that no one had written before because no one had needed to. The war would continue for 2 more years. More battles, more raids, more winters. Barbara and her children would face them all, armed with knowledge that most of their neighbors lacked. The cave would be used every winter until 1893, when the last of Barbara's grandchildren moved away to Pittsburgh and city life. But by then, the principle had spread. Other families, other caves, other underground shelters that saved livestock and lives when the mountains turned murderous. Barbara Jones died in 1891 at the age of 63. She was buried beside Samuel in the family plot on a hillside overlooking the valley where she had refused to die. Her headstone read, "She trusted the mountain, and the mountain kept her safe." The cave is still there. A hiker might find it today, climbing the ridges of what is now West Virginia, following old trails that generations of feet have worn into the limestone. The entrance is smaller than it used to be. Rockfalls have narrowed the opening, but the darkness beyond still breathes that constant, cool air. 52 degrees, summer or winter, always. The stone wall Barbara built has mostly collapsed, its carefully stacked rocks scattered by a century of weather. The sleeping platform rotted away decades ago. The pen where her hogs grunted and her cattle lowed is nothing but stone floor now, smoothed by water over millennia. But the cave remembers. Caves always remember. If you stood in that darkness, in that constant temperature, you could almost hear it. The echo of a baby's cry, the low murmur of cattle, the voice of a woman telling her children that they would survive. The experts told Barbara Jones that her plan was madness. They told her the damp would kill. They told her children needed sunlight. They told her birthing a baby underground was suicide. They were wrong. Not because they were foolish, they were experienced men and women who knew the mountains better than most. They were wrong because they measured survival by the standards of the world above ground. Heat fought with fire. Shelter built with walls. The endless battle against cold that could only be won by burning more fuel. Barbara didn't fight that battle. She refused to play that game. Instead, she asked a different question. What does the earth already provide? What is always there, constant and unchanging, asking nothing in return? The answer was 52 degrees. Cold? Yes. Uncomfortable, certainly, but not deadly. Never deadly. The same principle that Barbara discovered through desperation is taught in engineering schools today. They call it passive thermal management, letting the earth regulate temperature instead of fighting it with energy and fuel. Underground shelters, earth-bermed homes, root cellars, and cold storage that work the same in any century. The science has fancy names now. Barbara just called it common sense. When the world freezes above, the earth stays warm below. When the fire runs out, the stone remembers what temperature it's supposed to be. When everything fails, the cabin, the firewood, the plans you made for a life that war destroyed, the mountain offers one last chance. All you have to do is trust it. Barbara Jones stood at the mouth of a limestone cave on a January morning, her newborn son against her chest, watching the sun rise over a valley filled with frozen cattle, 8 degrees below zero. Inside the cave, 54 degrees. Warm enough to live, warm enough to survive. The neighbors had laughed when she turned a cave into a bunker. They had called it madness, desperation, the grief-addled plan of a widow who had lost her mind along with her husband. They weren't laughing anymore. The mountain had kept her safe. The mountain had kept them all safe. Her children, her livestock, even Martha Kincaid, who had stumbled through a blizzard to find shelter in the place she had dismissed as a grave. Somewhere in the valley below, Ezekiel Hammer was counting his frozen cattle and wondering how a pregnant widow had outsmarted 67 years of mountain wisdom. Somewhere out there, Sergeant Cobb was nursing his wounds and thinking about the woman who had shown him mercy he didn't deserve. And here, in the cave mouth, Barbara Jones was thinking about next winter, and the winter after that, and all the winters her children and grandchildren would face in a world that didn't care whether they lived or died. The experts would tell them to build bigger cabins, to cut more firewood, to fight the cold with fire and win through sheer force of fuel. Barbara had a different lesson to teach. Trust the mountain. Let the earth do the work. And never, ever let anyone tell you that the only way to survive is the way it's always been done. The way it's always been done gets people killed.